Hello, friends. We are very interested to know which cities you are listening to us from, so quickly like and write in the comments where you are from. Also, share what shocking stories happened in your city or maybe even with you personally. Subscribe because the next story could be about your city or even your personal drama. Now, let's dive into a new exciting story. Rain hammered the windows of the Reynolds two-story home, perched on a hill overlooking Puget Sound. October in Seattle was always like this gray, damp, and a little dreary, but Thomas Reynolds, or simply Tom, found a kind of coziness in it. He sat at the dining table in the spacious kitchen, sipping a bottle of Rainier beer and glancing at his son Oliver, who was picking at a plate of chicken and mashed potatoes with a fork. Clara, his wife, was standing at the stove, stirring something in a small saucepan, apparently sauce for tomorrow's dinner. The house smelled of garlic, rosemary, and the slight aroma of wet earth that wafted through the slightly open window. Tom leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes watching Oliver build a small mound of mashed potatoes, clearly not intending to eat. The 17-year-old boy was all in his headphones and his thoughts, as usual lately. The older children, Michael and Sophia, had already moved out. Michael was an engineer in Portland and Sophia was attending the University of Washington, and their absence had left a void in the house that Tom didn't yet know how to fill. "Oliver, are you going to eat this or just make sculptures?" Tom asked, smiling slightly. His voice was low, with a slight hoarseness, like that of a man who talks a lot at a construction site. Oliver looked up, took out one earbud, and shrugged. "Not particularly hungry. Can I go to my place? I haven't done algebra." Tom nodded, taking another sip of his beer. "Go. But if Mrs. Henderson calls me again tomorrow about your deuces, I will confiscate those headphones of yours. Seriously." "Yes, Dad, I got it," Oliver muttered, grabbed his plate and left, leaving behind a slight trail of teenage irritation. Clara turned from the stove, wiping her hands on the apron with embroidered music notes, a gift from Sophia last Christmas. Her brown locks were pulled back into a messy bun, and she looked tired but still beautiful. Tom noticed that in recent months she had become more silent, and it bothered him. He was used to her energy, the way she could fill a room with laughter or an impromptu tune on the living room piano. "He stopped talking to us completely," Clara said, sitting down opposite Tom with a glass of white wine in her hand. "This is normal for his age, right?" "Probably," Tom answered, shrugging his shoulders. "I wasn't a gift at 17 either. I remember how my father once almost threw out my bicycle because I skipped dinner to play football with the guys." Clara smiled, but the smile quickly faded. She took a sip of wine and looked out the window, where the rain was drawing blurry patterns on the glass. Tom felt that she wanted to say something more, but did not dare. He decided to push her. "You're kind of thoughtful today." "Tired after classes?" he asked, putting the bottle on the table. Clara taught music at Ballard High School, and October was always a busy month for her school concerts, orchestra rehearsals, parent-teacher conferences. But today she returned home earlier than usual, and Tom noticed that she didn't even turn on the radio, as she usually did while preparing dinner. "Not really," she answered, twirling the glass in her hands. I'm bored, Tom." He raised his eyebrows, not quite understanding what she was getting at. "Boring? At work? Or what?" "No, not at work," she said, finally looking into his eyes. "Here, with us, with all this." Tom froze, feeling a cold tension begin to grow in his chest. He was used to the fact that Clara sometimes grumbled about the routine, about his long hours at the construction site, about her endless schoolwork, about how the children grew up and left them alone. But there was something new in her voice, something that made him wary. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully, trying to keep his tone even. Clara sighed, put her glass down, and folded her hands on the table. "I don't know how to say this without you being offended, but I think we're stuck. 24 years, Vol. We do the same thing every day. Work, dinner, TV, sleep, and so on in a circle. I want something different." Tom frowned, trying to comprehend her words. "Something else. For example, go somewhere We haven't been on vacation for a long time. Maybe Lake Tahoe for the weekend. Let's take Oliver, rent a house." "No," she interrupted, shaking her head. "Not a vacation. I'm not talking about vacation. I'm talking about us. About our life together." He leaned back, feeling the chair creak under his weight. "Clara, can you just tell me what's bothering you? I'm not a telepath." She hesitated, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of the napkin. Finally, she straightened up and looked him straight in the eyes. "I'm bored with you, Tom," she said quietly but firmly. "I love you, I really do. But I want something more, something new." Tom felt his face tense. He wasn't sure if he was offended or just confused. "Are you bored with me?" he repeated, as if checking whether he had heard correctly. "Am I now some old shoe that needs to be thrown away?" "No, God, no," Clara said quickly, reaching across the table, but not touching it. "I don't want to lose you. I wish we had more freedom, so we can, try something new, together or not quite together." The last words hung in the air like smoke from a burning candle. Tom looked at her, trying to figure out if she was joking. But her face was serious, her eyes sparkled with wine and some strange excitement. "Not quite together?" he asked slowly. "Clara, are you serious? You want us to—" "What? Have you met other people?" She nodded, biting her lips slightly. "Yes, something like that. I've read about couples like this. They call it an open relationship. We stay together, but we have the freedom to experiment." Tom laughed shortly, sharply, almost involuntarily. He put down his beer and ran his hand over his face, as if trying to erase what he had heard. "Open relationship," he said, shaking his head. "Clara, we're in Seattle, not some hippie commune in California. Do you really think that I will agree to this, so that you go on dates with other men, and I? What? Would you look at this and smile? Not necessarily men," she said, and her voice became a little quieter. "Maybe women, I don't know. I just want to feel alive, Tom, and you could too. Well, if you want." He stared at her, feeling the laughter in his throat being replaced by something heavy. "Women? Are you serious? Clara, we've been married 24 years. We have 3 children. Have you ever hinted all this time that you like women?" "No," she admitted, looking down. "But I thought about it. Sometimes. Just fantasies. And then I started reading, watching things on the internet. And I realized that maybe this is not just a fantasy." Tom stood up, unable to sit still. He walked to the window, looking out over the dark bay where the lights of distant ships flickered through the rain. His brain was working full blast, trying to comprehend what his wife had just said. Clara, who baked pies for Thanksgiving, who taught Michael to play Twinkle, Twinkle on the piano, who cried when Sophia left for college, was now sitting at their kitchen table offering him this. "Do you understand how this sounds?" he said finally, turning to her. "As if you don't need me. Like I'm not good enough." "Tom, this is not about you," she said, standing up and approaching him. "You're wonderful. You've always been wonderful. But I feel like I'm suffocating. I don't want a divorce. I don't want to leave. I just wish we had more opportunities." "Opportunities," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "What if I say no? What then?" Clara hesitated, her hand froze in the air, never touching his shoulder. "Then, I don't know. I don't want to force you, but I'm not sure I can just forget about it." He turned to her, his gray eyes narrowed. "So you will sit and dream about other people. Is this your plan?" "No," she said, stepping back. "I want us both to be happy, so that we can find a way to do this together." "Together," he chuckled. "Clara, I'm not going to share you with someone. I'm not like that. You know me. I'm not one of those people who runs around bars looking for adventure. I thought you did too." "I was like that," she said quietly. "But people change, Tom. I'm changing." He nodded, but there was no agreement in this gesture, only tired understanding. He returned to the table, took the beer, and took a long sip. Clara looked at him, waiting for him to say something else, but he was silent. The silence between them was as heavy as the damp Seattle air. Let's just finish eating, he finally said, sitting back down. I don't want to argue about this right now. Clara nodded, but her face was tense. She returned to the stove, turned off the burner, and sat down at the table, picking up her glass. They ate in silence, only the clatter of forks on plates and the sound of rain breaking the silence. Tom looked at the chicken, but lost his appetite. He thought about how things used to be noisy dinners with the kids, laughter, arguments about whose turn it was to do the dishes. Now even Oliver ran off to his place, leaving them alone with this conversation. Remember how we went to Cape Cod when Michael was little? He said suddenly, breaking the silence. Then you taught him to play melodies on the sand by knocking on a bucket. Clara smiled, her eyes softening. Yes, he was so funny. I kept trying to eat sand. And Sophia was running after the crabs and squealing as if she was being cut, Tom added, grinning. And I almost sank the boat trying to pull out the net. You were a terrible fisherman, she said, laughing, but he cooked better than anyone on the other side. They fell silent, both looking at each other across the table. For a moment it seemed that everything was as before, that this conversation was just a strange dream. But then Clara looked away, and Tom realized that the past would not return. I don't want to lose this, Tom, she said quietly, but I don't want to continue pretending that what I have is enough for me. He nodded, finishing his beer. I heard you. Give me time to think, okay? Of course, she answered, but there was doubt in her voice. Tom stood up, put his plate in the sink, and walked out into the living room. He turned on the TV, but left the volume at a minimum just background, so as not to hear his own thoughts. Clara remained in the kitchen, finishing her wine and looking out the window. The rain got heavier and thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. The night promised to be long. Clara's words from the kitchen still echoed in his ears. Open relationships experiment. Freedom. He couldn't believe she had said it, his Clara, the woman who had been his support, his partner, the mother of his children for 24 years. He remembered how she looked at that moment, her brown hair, slightly disheveled, her eyes shiny with wine, and something else he couldn't name. It wasn't just boredom. It was something deeper, and it made him feel uneasy. Quiet sounds could be heard from the kitchen as Clara cleared away the dishes, clinking plates and opening the dishwasher. Usually she would turn on the radio, humming along to classic rock or jazz, but today it was quiet, just the rain and her footsteps. Tom wondered if she expected him to come back and continue the conversation, or if she hoped he would just leave her alone. He himself didn't know what he wanted. Part of him wanted to stand up, hug her, and tell her that everything would be the same. The other part, the part that was angry and felt betrayed, wanted to leave and slam the door. The door upstairs creaked, and Tom heard Oliver's footsteps coming down the stairs. The teenager appeared in the living room in his oversized Nirvana t-shirt and shorts, headphones dangling around his neck. His blonde hair, inherited from Clara, stuck out in all directions. "Dad, have you seen my charger?" Oliver asked, looking around the room. Tom pointed to the coffee table by the window. "Where you left it yesterday. Do you ever clean up after yourself?" Oliver chuckled, walked over to the table, and grabbed the cord. "Sometimes. Why are you sitting here in the dark? Do you watch movies without sound?" "Just thinking," Tom answered, trying to sound calm. "Go to bed, it's late." Oliver shrugged, but paused, looking at his father. "Did you and Mom argue again? She's kind of weird today." Tom tensed. He didn't want to drag his son into this. Oliver was already on edge, with his studies and constant mood swings. "It's okay, we're both just tired." "Go, don't worry." "Okay," Oliver said, but his look was incredulous. He turned and went back upstairs, leaving Tom alone. Tom leaned back on the sofa, closing his eyes. He tried to remember when it all started, this feeling that something had broken between him and Clara. Maybe when Sophia left for college 2 years ago, or when Michael moved to Portland. Children have always been their connecting link, their common project. Now that Oliver was almost an adult too, they were left alone with each other, and it seemed like that wasn't enough. The door to the kitchen opened and Clara walked into the living room, wiping her hands with a towel. She stopped in the doorway, looking at Tom. Her apron had been removed, and she was now wearing the simple gray t-shirt and jeans she wore around the house. In the soft light of the lamp, she looked younger than 45, but there was something tired in her eyes. "Are you going to remain silent?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest. Tom opened his eyes and looked at her. "What do you want me to say?" "You stunned me, Clara. I don't know how to react to this." She sighed and walked closer, sitting on the chair opposite the sofa. "I didn't want to upset you. I was just trying to be honest." "Honest," he repeated, putting the empty bottle on the table. "Is that what they call it now? You're asking me to share you with someone else, and is that fair?" "Tom, don't start," she said, her voice becoming a little harsher. "I'm not saying that you should agree right away. I just want to talk about this, like adults." He chuckled, but it wasn't funny. "Okay, let's talk. Do you really think that I can calmly watch you go on dates? How do you sleep with someone else? Is this normal for you now?" Clara looked away, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of the pillow on the chair. "I don't know if this is normal. I know I want this, and I thought you might also want to. Try it." "Try," he said, shaking his head. "Clara, I don't want anyone else. I thought you did too. We swore to each other, remember? In church, in front of all these people. 'Till death do us part,' and all that." She looked up at him, and a hint of guilt flashed through them. "I remember, and I don't want to break this oath. I'm not talking about divorce, Tom. I'm talking about expansion, so that we don't feel trapped." "Trapped," he repeated, and his voice became deeper, almost menacing. "Do you feel trapped with me?" "Not with you," she said quickly. "With this life, with the fact that every day is the same. I love you, but I want more." Tom stood up, unable to sit still. He walked to the window, looking out over the bay, where the rain blurred the lights of distant houses into a solid gray blur. His hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to unclench them. He didn't want to shout, didn't want to turn it into a scandal, but everything was boiling inside. "More," he said without turning around. "What if what I have is enough for me? What if I don't want any experiments?" Clara stood up and walked towards him, stopping a couple of steps away. "Then tell me this. Tell me that this is enough for you, and I will try to forget. But be honest, Tom. Do you really have enough? Do you ever think about what could have been different?" He turned around, looking into her eyes. Her question took him by surprise. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to convince her and himself that their life, their home, their routine was enough for him. But something stirred in the depths of his consciousness, some small, long-forgotten voice that whispered about how he sometimes looked at other women at a construction site, how he noticed their smiles, their gait. He brushed these thoughts aside because he was married, because he loved Clara. But now she opened the door herself. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice quieter than he expected. "Maybe, I think sometimes, but I don't want to do this. I don't want to ruin what we have. And I don't want to destroy," she said, stepping closer. "I want us to stay together, but I can't pretend that I'm not bored, that I don't want something new. It's not about you being bad, Tom. This is about me." He looked at her, feeling anger and confusion fighting inside. "And what do you propose? So do I just agree? For me to sit at home while you are out there somewhere? With someone?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "I want it for both of us. So you can too. Well, if you want. I don't want to control or force you. I want us both to be free." Tom laughed, louder this time, almost hysterically. "Are you free? Clara, can you even hear yourself? We are married. This is family. This is a responsibility. We have Oliver, who doesn't even know we're discussing this kind of crap." "Don't raise your voice," she said, her eyes narrowing. "I know that we have a family. I'm not going to leave Oliver or you. I just wish we didn't die inside while we live this life." "They died inside," he repeated, stepping back. "Do you really think so? That we're dead?" She fell silent, looking at him. The rain outside the window intensified, and somewhere in the distance lightning flashed, illuminating her face. She looked vulnerable, but determined at the same time. Sometimes, she said quietly, sometimes I feel like I'm in a cage. And I see that you are not beaming with happiness either. You come home from the construction site, sit here, watch TV, and remain silent. Where is Tom who sang songs to me in the car when we went to the lake? He felt a pang in his chest. She was right, he hadn't sung for a long time. He didn't dance with her in the kitchen, didn't joke like he used to. But he thought it was normal that this happens after 24 years together. I'm still here, he said, but his voice sounded uncertain. It's just, that's how life is. We're not 20-year-olds, Clara. I know, she said, her voice softening, but I don't want that to be all. I want to feel alive, Tom, and I want you to feel it too. He nodded but didn't answer. He returned to the couch and sat down, looking at the TV where Clint Eastwood was silently shooting at some thug. Clara remained standing by the window, hugging herself with her arms. The silence between them was thick, like the fog over the bay. I'll think about it, he said finally, without looking at her. But I don't promise anything. Okay, she replied, and there was relief in her voice. Thank you. She went back into the kitchen, leaving him alone. Tom took the remote control and turned on the sound. Shots and screams filled the room, but they could not drown out his thoughts. He looked at the screen, but saw only her face, her words, her proposal, which turned everything he knew about his life upside down. The morning in Seattle began with the usual grayness. Low clouds hung over the city like a wet blanket, and a weak wind blew small drops of rain through the streets. Thomas Reynolds was driving to his office. The radio was quietly playing classic rock, Sweet Home Alabama by Lynyrd Skynyrd, but Tom could barely hear the music. His thoughts were occupied with his conversation with Clara last night, her words about freedom and experimentation. He stayed up until almost 3 in the morning, staring at the bedroom ceiling, while Clara had long since gone to bed. In the morning, they hardly spoke. She silently poured herself coffee. He grabbed the toast and left, throwing a short "see you" over his shoulder. The office of Pacific Bridgeworks was located in the business district of South Lake Union, in a modern building. Tom parked in the underground parking lot, took his backpack with his laptop and drawings, and took the elevator to the 8th floor. There was a smell of freshly brewed coffee and paper, and the noise of the city could be heard from the open windows. Car horns, the rustle of tires on wet asphalt. His desk stood by the window overlooking Lake Union, where yachts bobbed on the waves despite the weather. Usually this sight calmed him, but today he didn't even look at it. Tom tossed his backpack onto a chair, turned on his computer, and opened the design for the new Snoqualmie River Bridge, a complex structure his team had been working on for 3 months. Drawings, load tables, support diagrams, all this was his element, the place where he felt confident. He put on his reading glasses, which he hated but could no longer live without, and plunged into his work. He needed to check wind load calculations. This was critical in Seattle, especially during storm season. He drew lines on the screen, checked numbers, made notes, and for a while, thoughts about Clara receded. "Tom, you're like a zombie today," said a voice behind him. He turned around and saw Sarah Miller, an architect in their department. Her short blonde hair was slightly disheveled, and her green eyes looked at him with a slight mockery. She held 2 mugs of coffee in her hands and handed one to him. "Thank you," he said, accepting the mug. "I just didn't get enough sleep." "It's noticeable," she answered, sitting down on the edge of his table. "You've been staring at the screen for an hour, as if there are answers to all life's questions. Is there something wrong with the bridge?" Tom shook his head, taking a sip of his coffee. It was hot and strong, with just a hint of cinnamon, something Sarah always added, claiming it perked up the day. "No, everything is fine with the bridge. It's just, my head is out of place." Sarah raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms over her chest. She was wearing a dark blue sweater and jeans. She always dressed simply, but with some unobtrusive style. "Is it because of the house, children, or did Clara organize a concert again?" Tom almost choked on his coffee. Sarah knew his family. They had run into each other a couple of times at company events, and Clara had once brought him lunch to the office when he was working late. But her directness still took him by surprise. "What are you, a psychic?" he asked, putting the mug on the table. "No, I just see when a person looks like he's been run over by a truck," she said, smiling. "Come on, lay it out. Or are you going to be silent all day and scare the interns?" Tom sighed, leaning back in his chair. He didn't plan on sharing this with anyone, especially a coworker, but Sarah wasn't one to back down easily. And to be honest, he needed to talk it out before his thoughts tore him apart from the inside. "Okay," he said, rubbing his temples. "Yesterday, Clara said that she was bored. With me. With our lives. And she suggested, well, to open our marriage." Sarah fell silent, her smile slowly fading. She placed her mug next to his and looked at him carefully. "Open marriage?" she asked again. "You mean like dating other people?" "Yes," he nodded, feeling his throat tighten. "She wants to experiment, as she called it. She says she doesn't want a divorce, but she needs more freedom. And so do I, sort of." Sarah whistled, throwing her head back. "Damn it, Tom. This is serious. And what did you say?" "I said I'll think about it," he replied, looking out the window. "But I don't know what to think. It's like a punch in the gut. I thought we were, well, living normally. And she, it turns out, is suffocating." Sarah nodded, her gaze softening. "I understand why you're shocked. How long have you been together?" 20 years. 24, he clarified. 3 children, a house, a mortgage, everything is like with people. And then she says this. "Well," Sarah said with a shrug, "maybe she's just going through a midlife crisis. This happened to me, only I was already divorced. Maybe she needs time to get over it." Tom looked at her, trying to figure out if she was joking or not. "Do you think this will pass?" She spoke yesterday as if she had already decided everything. She even mentioned women. Women? Sarah opened her eyes wide. "Seriously, Clara? I thought she was all so musical, homely." "I thought so too," he said, smiling bitterly. "And now she wants freedom. And I'm sitting here like a fool, and I don't know what to do." Sarah fell silent, looking at him. Then she stood up and nodded towards the corridor. "Let's go," she said. "Let's drink some normal coffee downstairs. You need to clear your head, otherwise you'll either ruin the drawings or strangle someone." Tom wanted to object, but changed his mind. She was right, there was no point in sitting and staring at the screen any longer. He grabbed his jacket, and they took the elevator down to a small coffee shop on the ground floor of the building. It smelled of fresh pastries and espresso, and behind the counter, a tattooed bartender deftly operated a coffee machine. They took lattes and sat by the window, looking at the passers by hiding under their umbrellas. "Okay," Sarah began, taking a sip of coffee. "Let's figure it out. Do you love her?" Tom nodded without thinking. "Yes, always loved. She is part of me." "Okay," she said, "and she is you." He says yes, he replied, looking into his mug. "But after yesterday, I'm not sure what that means anymore." Sarah chuckled, leaning back in her chair. "You know, I went through this. My ex, Derek, loved me too, in my own way. And then I found out that he was sleeping with our neighbor, and with her friend, and it seems, with someone from the gym. Everything is behind me." Tom looked up at her, surprised. He knew Sarah was divorced, but she never went into detail. "Seriously? And how did you know?" "By chance," she said, her voice becoming a little quieter. "I found his phone in the bathroom, and there were messages there. He didn't even try to hide much. I just thought I was too busy with work to notice." "Damn," Tom said, shaking his head. "This is disgusting. I'm sorry you had to go through this." "Okay," she replied, shrugging her shoulders. "It was 3 years ago. I survived. But I'll tell you what, Tom, when someone wants freedom, it rarely ends well. Either you agree and endure, or you put an end to it. Half measures don't work here." He nodded, feeling her words settle in his chest like a heavy burden. "I don't want to endure it," he said quietly. "I can't watch her with someone else. This will kill me." "Then tell her this," Sarah suggested, leaning forward. Be honest. If she loves you, she will think twice. And if not, well, then at least you'll know where you stand. Tom was silent, looking at the circles of foam in his coffee. He didn't want to think that Clara might choose this freedom of hers instead of him. But Sarah's words hurt him. He really didn't know where he stood. 24 years together, and he suddenly felt like a stranger in his own life. What if she's already with someone? He asked, almost in a whisper. She spoke yesterday as if it wasn't just an idea. It's like she's already thinking about someone specific. Sarah frowned, her fingers hovering over her mug. Are you serious? Do you think she's already cheating? I don't know, he admitted, rubbing his face with his hands. Maybe I'm paranoid. But she mentioned that she was reading about it, watching something. What if she already? Well, you know. Tom, Sarah said, her voice becoming firmer. If you really think that, you need to talk to her. Ask directly. Don't sit here and guess. It will finish you off. He nodded, but everything tightened inside. Should I ask Clara directly? He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear the answer. Maybe you're right, he said finally, but I don't know how to do it. I don't want everything to fall apart. Isn't it falling apart already? She asked, looking into his eyes. You're sitting here instead of working, and you look like you've been hit by a train. This is not normal anymore, Tom. He chuckled, but the laugh was bitter. Thank you for your honesty. You know how to cheer up. You're welcome, she replied, smiling. Look, I'm not a marriage expert, but I know that hiding from problems is the worst option. Talk to her, and if anything happens, call me for a beer. I'll listen to you scold the whole world. Tom smiled sincerely for the first time that morning. Agreed. Thank you, Sarah. They finished their coffee and returned to the office. Clara Reynolds parked her Subaru Outback in the parking lot of the Night Art School in Capitol Hill. It was a low brick building with large windows that let in warm light and a sign that said Capitol Hill Arts Center. She signed up for a photography course a couple of months ago when Sophia left for college and Oliver began spending more and more time in his room. She needed something of her own, something that would get her out of the routine of music lessons at school and household chores. Clara adjusted her bag on her shoulder, which contained her notebook, pen, and small idea pad, and went inside. The hallway smelled of fresh paint and coffee, and the walls were lined with student work watercolors, collages, and a few black and white photographs. She walked up to the second floor where her class was taking place and pushed open the classroom door. The room was small, with a long table in the middle littered with cameras, tripods, and old photography magazines. About a dozen people were already sitting on chairs, some were scrolling through their phones, some were chatting. Clara took her place by the window, looking out onto the wet streets of Capitol Hill, where the neon signs of bars and cafes reflected in the puddles. Hey, Clara, you're on time today, said Ellen, an older woman with bright red hair who was sitting next to her. She took this course as a hobby and loved to talk about her trips to Italy. I'm trying, Clara smiled, taking off her coat. Although there was a temptation to stay at home with a glass of wine and a TV series. Oh, I understand, Ellen laughed. But then you'll miss our new teacher. They say he is some kind of free artist. Daniel Harris, have you heard of him? No, Clara shook her head. I don't know much about photographers at all. I just want to learn how to shoot something beautiful. The door opened and a man entered the audience. Clara noticed him immediately. He was thin, with disheveled black hair and light stubble on his face. He was wearing a worn leather jacket, a black t-shirt and jeans, and in his hands he was carrying a backpack and an old Canon camera with a worn strap. His dark eyes scanned the room, and he smiled slightly wryly, but with a kind of warm confidence. Hello, everyone, he said, throwing his backpack on the table. I'm Dan Harris, your new teacher. Miss Lindsay, who taught this course, went to New York, so now you're stuck with me. I hope no one minds. There was a slight laugh, and Clara felt her spirits lift. There was something alive in his voice, something that was different from the monotonous lectures of her colleagues at school. Dan started talking about the lesson plan today. They were going to talk about composition and lighting, and then try to take some pictures in the classroom. He turned on the projector, and his photographs appeared on the screen. Black and white shots of the streets of Seattle, portraits of people in cafes, blurry silhouettes in the rain. "This is what I took last winter near Pike Place," he said, pointing to a photograph of a fisherman in a raincoat throwing a net. "The light was lousy, but the shadows did everything for me." Photography is not about technique, it is about how you feel when you press a button. Clara listened with her head slightly tilted. She liked the way he spoke without unnecessary seriousness, but with some kind of passion. She took out a notebook and began to write, although she mostly drew little notes in the corners of the pages. When Dan finished the lecture and suggested that everyone take their cameras and try to film something in the room, she got up and went to the window. Her gaze caught the reflection of the lights in a puddle on the street, and she raised the camera, trying to capture this moment. "Not bad," said a voice behind her. She turned around and saw Dan standing a couple of steps away. He looked at her camera, squinting slightly. "You think?" she asked, feeling her cheeks getting slightly warmer. "I'm actually a newbie." "It doesn't matter," he said, smiling. "You have an eye. You see the light, not just press a button. What inspired you?" Clara hesitated, lowering the camera. "I don't know. Probably music. I'm a music teacher. I'm used to catching the rhythm. And here it's kind of the same thing, only through a picture." Dan raised his eyebrows and his smile widened. "Music? Cool. What genre?" "Everything," she said, relaxing. "But more jazz. Bill Evans, Miles Davis. Sometimes the classics are Bach, if the mood is melancholic." "Bill Evans is strong," he nodded. "Waltz for Debbie is my favorite. You have excellent taste." Clara smiled, feeling something light, almost tangible, arise between them. "Thank you. And you? What do you listen to when you shoot?" "Miscellaneous," he said, shrugging. "Sometimes Nick Cave, sometimes Radiohead. Depends on my mood. But jazz is always a win-win. It's like photography, there's a lot of room for improvisation." She nodded, looking at him a little longer than she should have. His eyes were dark, almost black, but there was a warmth in them that she did not expect. The rest of the lesson passed quickly. Dan walked among the students, gave advice, and joked. Clara took a couple more pictures, a chair with a shadow from a lamp, Ellen's reflection in the mirror by the door. When the class ended, she packed her things and was already heading out when she heard his voice. "Clara, right?" Dan said, catching up with her in the corridor. "Do you mind having a glass afterwards? I usually go to the bar across the street after class. There's great wine and no crowds." She froze, her hand clenching the strap of her bag. Her first thought was to refuse. Tom and Oliver were waiting at home, the usual routine. But then she remembered their conversation last night, his silence, his departure into the living room. "And my own desire is to feel alive." "Why not?" she said, smiling. "Just one glass. Get up early tomorrow." "One glass, I can promise that," he said, and there was something playful in his voice. They left the building and crossed the street, going into a small bar called The Hideout. It was a cozy place with wooden walls, soft light from loft-style lamps, and shelves filled with bottles. Behind the counter stood a bartender with short blue hair, who nodded to Dan as if he were an old acquaintance. They sat at a table by the window, and Dan ordered 2 glasses of Pinot Noir, local, from the Willamette Valley, he said. "So," he began when the wine was brought, "tell me about the music. How did you even get into this?" Clara took a sip of the wine. It was tart, with a hint of cherry, and pleasantly warmed her throat. "By chance," she said, smiling. "As a child, I hated piano lessons, but my mother forced me to. And then in college, I took a course on the history of jazz, and that's it, I disappeared. I started playing, then teaching. It's like a way to express what words can't say." Dan nodded, twirling the glass in his hands. "Understand. I have the same thing with photography. Sometimes I shoot something and only later understand why it was important. It's like the camera sees more than I do." "That's beautifully said," she replied, looking at him. "How long have you been filming?" "About 15 years, he said. "I started in New York, running around the streets with a cheap film camera. Then he moved here and became a freelancer. Now I'm teaching people like you to seize the moment. Clara laughed, feeling the stress of the day melt away. Well, I'm not sure yet that I'm catching anything other than blurry spots. This is just the beginning, he said, leaning a little closer. You have a feeling. I see it. Maybe you should try filming something with music in your head. For example, imagine what Bill Evans would look like on film. She smiled, her fingers trembling slightly on the stem of the glass. Maybe I'll try. What would you shoot with his music? He thought, looking out the window. Rain, probably, or an empty park bench at night. Something quiet, but with depth, like his chords. Clara nodded, feeling drawn to him, to his voice, to his manner of speaking. They chatted for a while about music, about Seattle, about how he once filmed a homeless musician playing the saxophone at the market. The wine ran out, but Dan ordered another glass, despite her weak protest. You promised one, she said, but her smile showed that she didn't mind. I lied, he said with a wink, but you can leave at any time. I don't hold it. She stayed. They talked until midnight, until the bar began to empty. When Clara finally got up to leave, Dan walked her to her car. Thank you for the evening, she said, standing by her Subaru. I haven't talked like that for a long time. I liked it too, he replied, putting his hands in his jacket pockets. See you in the next lesson? Yes, she nodded, feeling a slight warmth in her chest. Good night, Dan. Calm down, Clara, he said, and his smile remained with her as she drove home to the quiet rustle of the windshield wipers. It was dark, only the light in the living room was on. Tom was apparently still watching TV. Clara entered quietly, trying not to make any noise, but her heart was beating faster than usual. She didn't know if it was just a conversation or something more. But for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. Saturday morning in Seattle dawned unexpectedly clear. The clouds parted to reveal a pale blue sky, and the sun reflected off Puget Sound, turning the water a shimmering silver. Thomas Reynolds left the house before Clara woke up. He left a note on the kitchen table, I'm going for a walk, I'll be back in time for dinner, and got into his pickup truck, heading towards the boardwalk near Myrtle Edwards Park. He needed space, air, something to shake Clara's words from his head, which had been playing there since last night like a broken record. He parked at the park, took an old jacket from the back seat, and walked along the shore. The wind was cold, with a salty taste of the sea, and drove small waves towards the stones. Seagulls squawked overhead, and in the distance, ferries moved lazily toward Bainbridge and Bremerton Islands. Tom put his hands in his pockets and walked along the gravel path, past cyclists and runners in bright jackets. It was quiet here, except for the sound of the water and the occasional ship's horn, and it was exactly what he needed: a place to think. Clara's words from their last conversation, I'm bored with you, Tom. I want freedom. Experiment hit him like these waves hit the stones. He couldn't understand how they got to this point. 24 years together, 3 children, a house overlooking the bay, which they bought after much arguing and saving. He thought they had built something strong, like the bridges he worked on in the office. But now Clara was talking about the cage, about being suffocated, and it made him feel guilty and useless at the same time. Tom stopped at a wooden bench, looking out over the water. He remembered their first meeting, a summer evening in Tacoma, where he lived at the time. He was 22. He had just graduated from the Faculty of Engineering and was working part-time at a construction site. Clara, a 20-year-old music college student, was playing the piano in a small cafe where he went with friends. She performed Gershwin's Summertime, her fingers dancing across the keys and her brown hair falling in her face. He couldn't look away. After the show, he walked up to her with a beer in his hand and said something stupid like, "You act like you know all my secrets." She laughed, and a week later they were walking together along the Tacoma waterfront, holding hands. He sat down on the bench, feeling the cold wood creeping through his jeans. Then everything was simpler. They were young, in love, full of plans. A year later, they were married, modestly, in a small church overlooking the bay. Michael was born 2 years later, then Sophia, then Oliver. Each child brought new joys and new worries. Tom remembered how Clara sang lullabies to Michael while sitting in a rocking chair in their first apartment, how she taught Sophia to play Twinkle, Twinkle on a toy piano, how she laughed when Oliver, at 3 years old, tried to blow on her flute. These were their moments, their lives, and now she wanted something different. Freedom, he muttered out loud, looking at the ferry as it slowly went towards the horizon. What the hell does that even mean? He pulled his phone out of his pocket and opened a photo album. There were pictures of Clara with her children on the beach in Ocean Shores, himself with Michael fishing, Sophia with her high school diploma. He leafed through them, feeling his throat tighten. The last photo was taken a couple of months ago. He and Clara are in the backyard, sitting in lounge chairs with glasses of wine. She was smiling, but now he noticed that her eyes were empty, as if she was already somewhere far away. Maybe he just didn't want to see it before. Tom got up and walked further along the shore, where the path turned towards the pier. The wind picked up, ruffling his jacket, and he turned up his collar to protect himself from the cold. He tried to imagine what it would be like to agree to her idea. Clara goes on a date with someone, laughs, returns home with this sparkle in her eyes that he hasn't seen for a long time. What is he? Sitting at home with beer and TV? Or is he also looking for someone? He remembered Sarah in the office, her green eyes, her straightforwardness. She was attractive, smart, but the thought of going on a date with her seemed alien to him, wrong. He didn't want this. He wanted Clara, the Clara he knew. I can't, he said quietly, stopping at the edge of the pier. The water splashed below, dark and cold. I can't share it. Don't want to. He leaned against the railing, looking at the horizon where the sky merged with the sea. He remembered their honeymoon. They went to Lake Crescent and rented a small house near the water. Clara then took him out for a swim at night, despite the cold, and they laughed, splashing water until they froze. Then they sat by the fire, wrapped in one blanket, and he felt her warmth, her breath on his neck. Then he thought it was forever. Now he wasn't sure. Tom took a small stone from his pocket that he had picked up on the path and threw it into the water. He watched the circles spread across the surface, disappearing into the waves. Maybe Clara is right. Maybe they really are stuck. He tried to remember the last time he felt alive, like she said. Working on bridges gave him satisfaction, but not passion. The children grew up. The house became quieter. But he didn't want freedom like she did. He wanted what they had, or at least what he thought they had. Damn, he breathed, rubbing his face with his hands. What should I do? He walked back to the bench, feeling the wind chilling to his bones. His thoughts raced between anger and fear. Anger because Clara put him before such a choice. Fear because he did not know what would happen if he said no. What if she's already with someone? This thought, which he had voiced to Sarah, now seemed real. She talked about fantasies, about women, about reading on the internet. What if these are not just words? What if she has already taken a step? Tom sat back on the bench, looking out at the water. He remembered their conversation in the living room, her voice, her eyes, her determination. She wasn't joking. She wanted it, and he knew he couldn't just brush it off. He needed to talk to her again, ask her directly what she really wanted. Sarah was right, hiding was not the answer. But how to ask this question, how to say, "Are you already cheating on me?" without everything collapsing. "I have to know," he said out loud, and his voice was drowned in the noise of the wind. "Today, no, I'll think about it. It's time to end this." He stood up, feeling determination slowly replacing confusion. He didn't know what Clara would say, didn't know if her answer would hold up. But he could no longer live in limbo. Tom walked back to the pickup, his steps firmer than before. The sun was already rising higher, illuminating the bay, and he thought that this might be the last clear day before a new wave rains. He needed to use it. When he got into the car, he took out his phone and texted Clara, "I'll be home in an hour. We need to talk. Seriously." He pressed send and started the engine. Thomas Reynolds returned home a little after noon, while the sun was still hanging over Puget Sound, casting long shadows on the wet grass in front of their two-story home. His pickup pulled into the driveway, the engine quit with a tired sigh, and Tom sat for a minute, looking at the front of the house, the white siding, the dark green shutters, the beds of wilting chrysanthemums that Clara had planted last spring. Everything looked as usual, but inside him there was a feeling that he was entering a strange place. He gripped the steering wheel, feeling the cold metal under his fingers, and took a deep breath. It was time to talk. He got out of the car, slamming the door louder than he had intended, and walked up the porch steps. The smell of coffee and something sweet inside smelled like Clara was baking cupcakes. There was music coming from the kitchen, the soft melody of a piano, Bill Evans, her favorite. Tom took off his jacket, hung it on a hook by the door, and walked into the living room. Oliver sat on the couch with a laptop on his lap, headphones dangling around his neck, and footage of some kind of gaming stream flashed on the screen. "Hey, Dad," Oliver said, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Where have you been?" "Walking by the bay," Tom answered, trying to sound calm. "Where is Mom?" "In the kitchen," Oliver said, nodding toward the door. "She's baking something. She told me not to touch it until it cooled down." "Okay," Tom nodded. "You sit here, okay? I need to talk to her." Oliver shrugged, turning back to his laptop. Tom walked through the living room, feeling the floorboards creak under his boots, and pushed open the door to the kitchen. Clara stood at the stove, removing a tray of golden cupcakes from the oven. Her brown hair was pulled back into a low ponytail, and she was wearing an old Ballard high t-shirt and jeans. She looked as always homely, cozy, but there was something tense in her movements, as if she was waiting for this conversation just like him. "Hi," Tom said, stopping in the doorway. "I see you are busy." Clara turned around, placing the baking sheet on the counter, and turned off the music on the small Bluetooth speaker. Her eyes met his, and a shadow of anxiety flashed in them. "Hello," she replied, wiping her hands on a towel. "Yes, I decided to bake something. I saw your note. How was the walk?" "Okay," he said, walking inside and sitting down at the kitchen table. "The weather is good for a change. But that's not what I wanted to talk about." She nodded, her fingers gripping the towel a little tighter. "That's what I understood. You wrote, seriously. What's happened?" Tom looked at her, feeling the resolve he had mustered at the bay begin to crack at the seams. He wanted to be calm, but anger was already boiling inside not only at her, but also at himself for not knowing how to start. "We need to finish this conversation," he said, his voice low and firm, "about your freedom. I thought about it all night and morning, and I need to know what you meant. That's it, no misunderstandings." Clara sighed, threw the towel on the counter, and sat down opposite him. Her hands lay on the table, her fingers trembling slightly. "Okay, Tom, I didn't want it to be so intense, but since you want to know, I'll tell you." "Speak," he said, crossing his arms over his chest, "and start with how serious this is. Are you just fantasizing, or are you already doing something?" She hesitated, her gaze falling on the table, then back up to it. I'm not just fantasizing. There is someone. Nothing serious, but I'm flirting with him." Tom felt his heart clench and then pound in his chest with such force that he could barely restrain himself from slamming his fist on the table. "You're flirting," he repeated, his voice sharper. "With whom? Who is this someone?" "His name is Dan," she said quietly, but without hesitation. "He teaches a photography course that I take. We just talked. A couple of times. Yesterday after class, we drank wine at the bar. This is all." "This is all?" he asked, leaning forward. "You're sitting with some guy in a bar, drinking wine, and you're telling me that you're bored with me? And this, in your opinion, is normal?" Clara straightened up, her eyes narrowed. "Tom, don't shout. I didn't sleep with him, if that's what you mean. We were just talking. He's interesting. And yes, I'm not bored with him." He stood up, the chair creaking on the floor, and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard, where the swing the children had once swung on now hung motionless. His hands clenched into fists, and he forced himself to unclench them, but his anger was already bursting out. "It's not boring," he said, turning to her. "It's boring for me." You sit here, bake cupcakes, and then go flirt with some photographer because apparently I'm not interesting enough. Do you even know what that sounds like? I understand, she replied, her voice becoming firmer, and I'm not going to apologize for how I feel. I told you the truth, Tom. I could have lied, but I didn't. Thank you for your honesty, he said, his tone full of sarcasm. And what next? Do you want to sleep with him? Is this your plan? Clara stood up, her cheeks turning red. I don't know what I want next. Maybe yes, maybe not. But I want us to have a chance to find out together. I propose a compromise. Open relationships. We remain a family, but we have freedom. You two can. Don't you dare, he interrupted, stepping towards her. Don't you dare say that I can. I don't want anyone else, Clara. I thought you did too. And you're already flirting with someone behind my back. Do you have any idea how I feel now? She fell silent, looking at him. Her eyes sparkled, but she did not cry. There was more determination in them than guilt. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said finally. I thought you would understand. We could do this together, without lies. I still love you, Tom. You love me, he chuckled, shaking his head. This doesn't look like love. It's like you're tired of me and looking for a way out. And this Dan of yours, does he already know? Did you tell him you're married? No, she said, looking down. I didn't say. For now, it's just talk. But I like him, and I don't want to pretend that it's not true. Tom felt everything turn inside him. He turned and walked towards the door leading to the garage without looking at her. Where are you going? She asked, her voice trembling. I need to think, he said over his shoulder. And I don't want to do it here, looking at you. He pushed the door open and walked down the short stairs into the garage. It smelled of oil and wood and damp, a familiar smell that always calmed him. In the corner stood an old boat, a wooden boat that he had bought 10 years ago with the dream of restoring and launching. It remained unfinished. The body was covered with dust. The paint was peeling. The oars lay in the corner. Tom turned on the lamp above the workbench, took the plane, and began removing shavings from the side of the boat without thinking about what he was doing. He just needed to keep his hands busy so he wouldn't break something. The door upstairs creaked, and he heard Clara's footsteps. She stopped on the threshold, looking down at him. Tom, she said quietly, can we talk normally? No screaming? I'm not shouting, he answered without looking up. The wood creaked under the plane, shavings fell to the floor. I can't listen to this. You flirt with some guy and offer me a compromise. This is not a compromise, Clara. This is betrayal. This is not betrayal, she said, going down a couple of steps. I didn't sleep with him. I didn't lie to you. I want us to find a way to be happy. Happy, he repeated, throwing the plane onto the workbench with a dull thud. Do you think I'll be happy knowing you're with someone else? Do you have any idea how I feel? I imagine, she said, her voice becoming quieter. But I can't pretend anymore that what I have is enough for me. I don't want a divorce, Tom. I want us. But with this too. He looked at her, his gray eyes dark with anger and pain. You can't have it both ways. I can't live like this, and if you don't understand this, then maybe you should think about it. Clara fell silent, her hands clenched into fists. She turned around and walked back into the kitchen, quietly closing the door. Clara Reynolds sat in her Subaru in the parking lot of an old warehouse converted into studios for artists and photographers. The building was low, with peeling brickwork and large windows through which warm light filtered through. She signed up for an extra photography class, a personal consultation, as Dan Harris called it in his post. Her fingers squeezed the steering wheel, and her last conversation with Tom was spinning in her head, his anger, his departure to the garage, his words about betrayal. She hadn't seen him since the morning he had left for work earlier, leaving only an empty coffee mug in the sink. Clara took a deep breath, feeling her heart beat faster than usual. She told herself it was just a meeting. They would talk about her photographs, about composition, about lighting. But deep down she knew this was more than a lesson. Her bag lay on the passenger seat, a camera, a notepad, a couple of pens. She took it, got out of the car and raised her hood, protecting herself from the rain. At the entrance to the studio, she pressed the intercom button with the sign D. Harris, third floor. Clara, came his voice, slightly distorted by the speaker. Yes, it's me, she answered, trying to sound casual. The door clicked, and she stepped inside. The hall smelled of dampness and old wood, and the stairs creaked under her sneakers. On the third floor, she was met by Dan standing in the doorway of his studio. His black hair was messy, as always, and he was wearing a dark shirt with rolled-up sleeves and jeans. He smiled, and a spark flashed in his dark eyes. Glad you came, he said, stepping aside. The weather is rubbish. I thought you would change your mind. I'm not one of those who is afraid of rain, she answered, taking off her wet hood and shaking out her hair. In Seattle, it's like breathing. Exactly, he laughed, closing the door. Come in, it's warm and dry here. And there's coffee if you want. The studio was spacious, with high ceilings and bare brick walls. In the corner, there was an old sofa littered with pillows. Along the walls, there were shelves with books, films, and cameras. The large table was littered with photographs, and black and white photographs hung on the wall streets, faces, abstract shadows. There was a tripod by the window with a camera aimed at the street, where the rain was drawing patterns on the glass. Music was playing quietly from the speaker's Nick Cave, Into My Arms, melancholic and deep. Cool place, Clara said, looking around. Your soul can be felt directly. Thanks, Dan replied, walking over to the small coffee maker in the corner. This is my chaos. Would you like some coffee? Or straight to the point? Coffee sounds tempting, she said, putting her bag on the sofa. Black, without sugar. He nodded, pouring 2 mugs, and handed one to her. Her fingers touched him lightly, and she felt warmth not just from the coffee. They sat down at the table, and Clara took out her camera and some printed pictures she had taken during the last lesson. Here, she said, spreading out the photo. This is what I tried to remove on your advice. I'm not sure if it worked. Dan took the pictures, his gaze becoming attentive. One was the reflection of lights in a puddle, another was the shadow of a chair in a classroom. The third was a portrait of Ellen taken through a mirror. You have a feeling, he said, putting the pictures aside. Especially this one, with the puddle. Light works like a melody. Did you think about jazz when you were filming? Clara smiled, taking a sip of her coffee. Maybe subconsciously. I always hear music when I do something creative. It's noticeable, he nodded, leaning closer. You have a talent for catching the mood. You just need a little more confidence in the shot. Would you like me to show you how you can enhance the composition? Yes, of course, she said, feeling her pulse quicken. Dan stood up and walked over to the stand by the window, motioning for her to come. He set up the camera, looking through the viewfinder, and began to explain about the rule of thirds, about the balance of light and shadow. Clara stood nearby, listening to his voice, which was soft but confident. His shoulder lightly touched hers, and she did not move away. When he finished, he turned to her, and their faces were closer than she expected. Try it yourself, he said, stepping back a little, but without looking away. Clara leaned toward the camera, looking through the viewfinder. She saw the rain outside the window, blurry lights, the silhouette of a lantern. Her fingers pressed the button, and the shutter clicked. She straightened up, smiling. I think it worked, she said, turning to him. Let me see, he said, stepping closer. He picked up the camera, looked at the picture on the screen, and nodded. Great. You have an eye for this. You could shoot more than just for the course. Thank you, she said, feeling warm from his words. That's good to hear. They stood in silence, looking at each other. The music changed to another Nick Cave song, the ship song, slow and drawn out. Clara felt the air thicken between them, as if something inevitable was about to happen. Dan stepped closer, his hand lightly touching her elbow. Are you okay? He asked quietly. You look thoughtful. Yes, she said, her voice slightly hoarse. It's just, there's a lot going on in my head. Do you want to tell me? He suggested, his fingers lingering on her hand. Clara looked into his eyes, dark, deep, with some kind of magnetism. She knew she had to say no, leave, go home to Tom, to their routine, to their problems. But instead, she stepped closer, feeling her breathing quicken. Maybe later, she said, and her voice trembled. Dan smiled slowly, almost dangerously. He leaned down and their lips met first carefully, like a test, then deeper, with a hunger that she did not expect. His hands went to her waist, her fingers ran through his hair, and she felt everything inside her explode, a mixture of guilt, arousal, and relief. It was not like with Tom, not familiar and safe, but new, wild, almost frightening. She pulled away, breathing heavily, her cheeks burning. Sorry, Dan said, but there was no regret in his voice. I didn't plan. Don't apologize, she interrupted, stepping back. I don't know what I'm doing. He nodded, putting his hands in his pockets. Are you okay, if you want to leave? No, she said quickly, too quickly. Just give me a minute. Clara walked over to the sofa and sat down, feeling her heart pounding. She closed her eyes, trying to figure herself out. The guilt was sharp as a knife. She thought about Tom, about his anger in the garage, about his words. But the excitement was stronger. It flowed through their veins like the wine they drank at the bar last week. She wanted this, she wanted Dan, she wanted this feeling, this freedom that she told Tom about. And now she has taken a step that cannot be undone. You're married, right? Dan asked, sitting down next to her, but not touching her. She opened her eyes, looking at him. Yes, 24 years old. He nodded, his gaze calm but attentive. So what now? I don't know, she said honestly. I didn't plan this, but I don't regret it. Dan smiled, lightly touching her hand. Then don't think about it too much. It's just a moment. We can stop if you want. Clara shook her head, her fingers squeezing his hand. Don't want to. They kissed again, longer, slower, and she let herself get lost in it. Time dissolved an hour, maybe more. When she finally packed her things to leave, the rain outside the window died down, leaving only silence. Dan walked her to the door, his hand lingering on her shoulder. See you in class? He asked. Yes, she said, smiling. Good night, Dan. Calm down, Clara, he answered, and his voice stayed with her as she walked down the stairs. The journey home was short, but it seemed like an eternity. Clara entered the house quietly, trying not to wake Oliver, who, judging by the light under the door, was not yet asleep. Tom was sitting in the living room. The TV was showing some old movie, but the sound was turned off. He looked up as she entered, and his gaze lingered on her. You're late, he said. His voice was even, but there was something sharp in it. Yes, she answered, taking off her coat. The lesson was delayed. We discussed the pictures. Tom nodded, but his eyes narrowed. He noticed her high spirits, a slight smile, a sparkle in the eyes that hasn't been there for a long time. You look like you liked it, he said, and there was more than just an observation in his tone. Yes, she said, trying to sound neutral. It was interesting. I'm going to bed. I'm tired. Thomas Reynolds sat in the living room, staring at the old Seattle Seahawks versus Green Bay Packers television. The sound was turned off. He didn't want to hear the comments, just watched as the players ran around the field in slow motion. There was an empty bottle of Rainier beer on the coffee table and another half-full one lying next to it. He didn't sleep almost all night, replaying last night in his head Clara's return, her smile, her sparkle in her eyes, which was alien. Clara came downstairs around 7 in the evening. Her steps were light, almost inaudible against the background of the sound of the rain. She walked into the living room wearing her school t-shirt and jeans, her hair down and slightly damp from her shower. She stood in the doorway, looking at Tom, and her face tensed, as if she sensed the storm that was brewing within him. Are you not at work? She asked, her voice cautious, but with a hint of surprise. Took a day off, Tom answered, without taking his eyes off the screen. He said he was sick. I didn't want to sit there and stare at the drawings. Clara nodded, shifted from foot to foot. Oliver is at a friend's. He said he'll be back late. I thought about cooking something. Are you hungry? No, he said, finally turning to her. His gray eyes were dark, almost black in the dim lamplight. I'm not hungry, Clara. I want to talk. She froze, her hands clenched into fists, then relaxed. She walked over to the chair opposite the sofa and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. Okay, she said quietly. About what? Tom put the beer down on the table. His movements were sharp, almost rude. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked her straight in the eyes. His voice was low, hoarse, as if he was holding back something that was ready to burst out. Did you sleep with him? He asked without preamble. With this Dan of yours. Tell me the truth. Clara turned pale. Her lips trembled slightly. She looked away, looking at the window where the rain was making blurry patterns. Tom, Don't wag, he interrupted, his tone becoming harsher. I don't want maybe or it's complicated. Yes or no, Clara? Did you sleep with him? She fell silent, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair. Silence hung between them, heavy as the wet air outside the window. Finally, she raised her eyes, but did not meet his gaze. She was looking somewhere to the side. No, she said quietly. I didn't sleep with him. But we kissed. Yesterday, in his studio. Tom felt his insides clench, as if someone had hit him in the chest. He stood up, the chair creaking under him, and walked to the window, turning his back to her. His hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He was waiting for it, he was afraid of it, but hearing it was still like a blow. We kissed, he repeated, his voice trembling with anger. You went to his studio and you kissed. And what else? What are you not saying? Nothing more, she said, her voice becoming a little louder. It just happened. I didn't plan to. We talked, and then, I don't know, Tom. I don't know how to explain it. He turned around, his face was red, his eyes were burning. Don't know how to explain? You are my wife, Clara, 24 years, and you go to some photographer, kiss him, and you tell me that you don't know how to explain it. Is this normal for you now? Clara stood up, her cheeks also flushed, but there was more stubbornness in her eyes than guilt. Don't yell at me, Tom. I'm not going to make excuses for how I feel. I told you that I want freedom, that I need more. You knew it. I knew, he said, taking a step towards her. But I didn't know that you were already running towards him behind my back. You said flirting, and now it's kissing in the studio. What's next? Will you get into bed with him and say that this too just happened? Maybe I'll go to bed, she said, her voice becoming cold. If you don't give me a chance to be honest with you. I suggested a compromise, Tom. You rejected him. He froze, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. Her words, maybe I'll lie down, echoed in his head, tearing something inside. He wanted to scream. He wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake her so that she would understand what he was doing. But instead, he felt his anger give way to something heavy, almost dead. Compromise, he said quietly, almost in a whisper. You call it a compromise, and I call this betrayal. You've already made your choice, Clara, and it's not me. She stepped towards him, her hand reaching for his shoulder, but he retreated as if her touch would burn. Tom, I don't want to lose you, she said, her voice trembling. I love you, but I can no longer live the way I used to. I want us, but with this too. There is no us with this, he said, his voice as hard as steel. You can't have everything at once, and I won't stand by and watch you do it. He turned and walked towards the door, grabbing his jacket from the hook. Clara followed him. Her steps were fast, almost panicky. Where are you going? She asked, her voice breaking. Tom, don't go. Let's talk. I can't stay here, he said without turning around. I need air. Don't wait for me. He opened the door, and the cold wind hit him in the face, bringing with it the smell of rain and sea. He walked down the steps without looking back and got into the pickup truck. The engine started the first time, and he drove out onto the road, not knowing where he was going, until he ended up at a small harbor in a few miles from home. It was a simple place, 2 floors, white walls, a sign with an anchor. He parked, took his bag from the back seat. It was always there for long shifts, and went inside. The reception was empty, except for an elderly woman with gray hair sitting at the counter, leafing through a magazine. She looked up as he approached. "A room for one night," he said, taking out his wallet. "Anyone, as long as it's quiet." $75, she answered, her voice hoarse like a smoker's. "Cash or card?" "With a card," he said, handing her the plastic. She gave him the key to room 12 on the second floor, and he went up the stairs, feeling like my legs were filled with lead. The room was small bed, table, TV, window overlooking the parking lot. He threw his bag on the floor, sat down on the bed, and dropped his head into his hands. The rain beat on the window, and in this silence he heard only his thoughts, loud, chaotic, painful. Thomas Reynolds woke up in his Harbor Inn room with a feeling of heaviness in his chest that had not left him since the night before. He lay on the narrow bed, looking at the ceiling stained with old leaks, and listened to the air conditioner humming somewhere behind the wall. His clothes, jeans, and a shirt were wrinkled from sleep, but he did not change. "The only things in my bag were a clean pair of socks and a toothbrush, which was enough to get me through the day." Tom stood up, feeling his muscles numb, and went to the window. The parking lot below was almost empty, except for an old sedan and its pickup truck parked under the dim light of a street lamp. He ran his hand over his face, feeling the stubble, and looked at the phone. A message from Clara came at 3 o'clock in the morning. "Tom, please come home. We need to talk." He didn't answer. After their conversation in the living room, after her confession about kissing Dan and her, "Maybe I'll go to bed," he couldn't go back. Not now, maybe never. He picked up his phone and opened the website of the law firm he had spoken with that morning, Harris and Associates. The consultation was scheduled for tomorrow, but he didn't want to wait. He found a separation agreement template, the first step to getting a divorce in Washington state, and downloaded it. It was a simple document: division of property, accommodation, finances. He knew that without a lawyer it was unofficial, but he needed to do something concrete to put an end to this chaos. Tom sat down at the small desk in the room, opened the laptop from his bag, and began filling in the fields, typing slowly but decisively. "We, Thomas Reynolds and Clara Reynolds, hereby agree to live separately from the date of this document." His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He remembered their home, the kitchen where Clara baked cupcakes, the living room where Oliver played his games, the bedroom where they slept side by side for 24 years. This was their home, their life, and now he was dividing it into pieces, like an old drawing that was no longer needed. He gritted his teeth and continued typing. By noon, the document was ready, 4 pages of text, dry and formal. He indicated that he was leaving the house to Clara, taking only the pickup truck and part of his savings. They only had Oliver as children under 18, and he wrote that they would decide to have him live together until he finished school. Finances in half, without alimony, until there is a trial. He printed 2 copies on a small printer in the hotel lobby, paying $5 to the woman at the counter who didn't even look up from her magazine. Tom put the papers in an envelope, took his bag, and drove home. The road was familiar, past the park, along the bay, through quiet streets with wet leaves on the sidewalks. When he arrived at the house, his heart sank. Clara's car was parked in the driveway, and warm light poured from the windows. He turned off the engine and sat for a minute, looking at the porch. He didn't want to go in, but he had to. He entered the house, quietly closing the door. The smell of fried onions and spices came from the kitchen. Clara was preparing something, probably soup. Oliver was upstairs. Tom could hear the muffled sound of his music through the closed door. He walked into the living room, throwing his bag on the sofa, and stopped when Clara came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on the apron. "Tom," she said, her voice soft, almost pleading. "You're back." "Not really," he replied, his tone even but cold. "I came to give you something." She frowned, her brown hair falling into her face, and she brushed it away with a trembling hand. "Give what? Where have you been all night?" "At the hotel," he said, taking an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I couldn't stay here after yesterday, and I decided that it was time for us to formalize this." Clara looked at the envelope, and her eyes widened. "Design? What is this, Tom?" "Separation agreement," he said, handing her the papers. "I filled it out today." This isn't a scam yet, but it's a start. Read and sign if you agree." She took the envelope, her fingers trembling as she opened it. She pulled out the papers, skimmed the first lines, and her face turned pale. "Tom, are you serious? Do you want this? Right now?" "Yes," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "After what you said yesterday, I don't see any other way out. You kissed him, Clara. You want to sleep with him. I can't live with this." Clara sank onto the sofa, the papers lay on her lap. Her eyes filled with tears, and she covered her face with her hands, trying to hold back her sobs. "I didn't want it to end like this," she said, her voice shaking. "I thought we would find a way. I love you, Tom." "Love doesn't kiss others in studios," he said, his voice becoming harsher. "You made a choice. I won't stand by and watch you do this. Sign and I'll leave." She raised her head, tears streaming down her cheeks, leaving dark stains on her t-shirt. "And Oliver, have you thought about him? He's still at home, Tom. He's 17. We can't just—" "I wrote that we will solve this together," he interrupted. "He can live with you or with me when I find a place. But I won't stay here, Clara. Not after this." Clara fell silent, looking at the papers. Her fingers clutched the edges of the sheets, as if she could hold on to their marriage by squeezing those words. She stood up, walked to the kitchen table, and took a pen from the drawer. Her movements were slow, almost mechanical. She signed both copies. Her signature, usually neat and smooth, was now jagged and shaky. "Here," she said, handing him one copy. "Are you satisfied?" Tom took the paper, feeling his insides shrink. He wasn't happy, he was crushed, but he couldn't show it to her. "This is not about contentment," he said quietly. "It's about the fact that I can't do it anymore." She nodded, her tears falling to the floor, and she turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. Tom looked at her for a second, her hunched shoulders, her trembling, and felt a pang of guilt, which he immediately suppressed. He didn't do it. She did it. The door upstairs opened, and Oliver walked down the stairs, his steps heavy as if he knew something was wrong. He entered the living room, looking at his parents, Clara at the table, Tom with papers in his hands. His blonde hair stuck out in all directions, and there was something wary in his eyes. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice low, almost accusing. "Are you arguing again?" Tom looked at his son, feeling his throat tighten. "We're not arguing, Oliver. We decided something. I'll live separately for now." Oliver frowned, his eyes darting to Clara and then back to Tom. "Separately? What, are you getting a divorce?" "Not yet," Tom said, trying to sound calm. "It's just a break. We'll figure it out." Clara turned around, her face wet with tears. "Oliver, it's not your fault. We just—" "I don't care whose fault it is," he interrupted, his voice getting louder. "You've both been weird for a week now. I don't want to listen to this." He grabbed his jacket from the rack and walked towards the door without looking at them. "I'm going to Jake. Don't wait." "Oliver, wait," Clara said, stepping towards him, but he had already opened the door and walked out, slamming it so hard that the glass shook. Tom watched his son leave, feeling like another part of his life was falling apart. He turned to Clara, who stood hugging herself, her tears flowing silently. "I'll go," he said, taking his bag. "I'll leave the house to you. Call me if there's anything wrong with Oliver." She nodded without saying a word. Tom walked out onto the porch, feeling the fog settling on his jacket. He got into the pickup, threw the papers on the passenger seat, and started the engine. As he drove away, he saw in the rearview mirror Clara standing in the doorway, looking after him. Her silhouette was blurry, like everything else that day. He returned to the hotel, booked a room for another week, and sat down at the table, looking at the signed agreement. It was the end, not official, but real. Clara cried, but signed. She didn't fight. And this, most of all, convinced him that there was no turning back. Clara was sitting in the kitchen at the table. In front of her was a cup of cold tea and a plate of half-eaten toast. She stayed up most of the night, replaying in her head the moment she signed the separation agreement that Tom left her yesterday. Her signature, trembling, uneven now, seemed to her like a betrayal, although she herself did not know who exactly she had betrayed, Tom, herself, or their family. The house was empty without him. His jacket wasn't hanging by the door. His beer wasn't in the refrigerator. His footsteps weren't on the stairs. Even Oliver, who went to see a friend after their conversation, did not return to spend the night, and this only increased her loneliness. She looked at her watch 8:30. It was already dark outside, and the Puget Sound turned into a black spot where only rare lights of ships made their way through the fog. Clara stood up to make more tea when she heard the front door creak. Her heart sank. She hoped it was Tom, although she knew that he would not return. But Oliver entered the kitchen instead, throwing his backpack on the floor with a thud. His blonde hair was tousled by the wind, his jacket was wet, and there was something dark, almost evil, in his eyes. "Hello," Clara said, trying to smile. "Where have you been? I called you." "Jake's," he answered briefly, without looking at her. He walked to the refrigerator, opened it, and pulled out a bottle of soda. The phone died. "You could have warned," she said, her voice soft, but with a hint of reproach. "I was worried." Oliver chuckled as he opened the bottle with a hiss. He took a sip and finally looked at her, crossing his arms over his chest. "Were you worried? Seriously? You and Dad organized a circus yesterday, and now you're worried that I'm not calling." Clara froze, her hand gripping the edge of the tabletop. She knew that this conversation was inevitable, but she was not ready for it, not now, not after a sleepless night and tears. "Oliver, this is not a circus," she said quietly. "Dad and I. We have problems. You saw it." "I saw it," he said, his voice growing louder. "I'm not blind. You argue, Dad leaves, you cry, and then he says that he will live separately. What's going on, Mom? Are you getting divorced?" She looked down, feeling her throat tighten. She wanted to lie, to say that everything would work out, but Oliver was not a child. He was 17, and he had seen more than she thought. She slowly sat back down at the table, pointing him to the chair opposite. "Sit down," she said. "We need to talk." Oliver rolled his eyes, but sat down, throwing the soda onto the table with a light thud. "Well, come on. Explain. Because I don't understand what you're doing." Clara took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the cup as if she could find support in it. "Dad and I, we decided to live separately," she began. Her voice was even, but trembling at the edges. "Yesterday, he brought a separation agreement, and I signed it. This is a step towards divorce, yes." Oliver sat up straighter, his eyes widening, then narrowing. "For divorce? Are you serious? Why? What's happened?" She hesitated, looking at him. She didn't want to drag him into this, into her kiss with Dan, into her desire for freedom, into Tom's anger. But he looked at her as if he could see through her silence, and she knew that the half-truth would only anger him even more. "Dad and I haven't gotten along for a long time," she finally said. I got bored, Oliver. I felt trapped. I wanted more than this life, home, work, routine. I suggested he try something new, but he didn't agree." "Anything new?" he asked, his tone harsh. "What does this mean? Are you dating someone?" Clara turned pale, and her fingers tightened their grip on the cup. She didn't want to tell him about Dan, but Oliver was too smart not to put two and two together. I met a person," she said quietly. "It's not what you think. We were just talking, but yes, I crossed the line. Dad found out, and he couldn't accept it." Oliver sat back in his chair, his face red, his eyes sparkling with anger. "Did you cross the line? Did you cheat on him? Seriously, Mom." "This is not cheating in the full sense," she said quickly, her voice breaking. "We kissed once. I didn't sleep with him. But Dad, he didn't even want to talk about it. He said it was a betrayal and left." "Because this is betrayal," Oliver shouted, jumping up from his chair. "You kissed some guy, and then you're surprised that Dad left? Do you even understand what you're doing?" Clara stood up, her hands shaking. "Oliver, I didn't want it to turn out like this. I love Dad. I wanted us to stay together, but with some kind of freedom. He's too stubborn to even try to understand me." "Stubborn?" he asked, his voice becoming louder. "It's your fault, Mom. You went to someone else, and now you blame him? Do you even think about us? About me? She stepped towards him, her eyes filling with tears. Of course, I think so. You are my son, Oliver. I didn't mean to hurt you. This is between me and Dad. No, this is not just between you, he interrupted, stepping back. This is my home too, and you destroyed it because you were bored. You're selfish, Mom. Clara froze, her tears flowing down her cheeks, but she could not say anything. His words hit her like a slap in the face, and she felt something inside breaking. Oliver, please, she said, her voice hoarse. I didn't want this. I wanted to live, to feel alive. Alive, he repeated, his tone full of contempt. What about Dad? He is now somewhere alone because you decided to live. I don't want to listen to this. He turned, grabbed his backpack, and walked towards the door. Clara rushed after him, her hand catching his sleeve. Where are you going? She asked, her voice breaking. Oliver, stay. Let's talk. I'm going to see Dad, he said, pulling his hand away. I need to talk to him, not you. You ruined everything. He opened the door and walked out without looking back. The wind rushed into the house, bringing with it the cold and the smell of wet earth. Clara stood in the doorway, watching his silhouette disappear into the fog, and felt tears running down her face. She closed the door, leaned her back against it, and slid to the floor, hugging her knees with her hands. Her sobs were quiet but deep, as if she was mourning not only Oliver, but everything she had lost. Meanwhile, Oliver was walking down the street. His jacket was wet from the light drizzle, and his backpack was hitting his back hard. He took out his phone and dialed Tom's number, his fingers trembling with cold and anger. Dad, he said when Tom answered. Where are you? I need to talk to you. At the Harbor Inn, Tom answered, his voice tired but firm. Number 12. Come if you want. I'm coming, Oliver said and hung up. He walked quickly, almost running, through familiar streets, past the park where he and Tom had once flown a kite, past the coffee shop where Clara bought him hot chocolate. His thoughts were chaotic anger at his mother, pity for his father, fear for what would happen next. When he got to the hotel, his clothes were wet and his face was red from the wind. He went up to the second floor and knocked on the door of number 12. Tom opened almost immediately, his gray eyes dark with fatigue. He was wearing the same shirt as yesterday, with wrinkled sleeves, and holding a bottle of water in his hands. Oliver, he said, stepping aside, come in. You're all wet. Oliver walked in, throwing his backpack on the floor, and sat down on the chair by the table. The room was small and smelled of dampness and cheap soap, but he didn't care. I talked to Mom, he said, his voice sharp. She said you were getting a divorce, that she kissed some guy, and you left because you couldn't accept it. Tom nodded, sitting down on the bed opposite him. That's right, he said quietly. She wanted freedom. I couldn't live with it. That's it. Oliver clenched his fists, looking at his father. She said you were stubborn, that you didn't even want to try. But she ruined everything, Dad. She's selfish. I don't want to stay with her. Tom looked at his son, feeling his heart swell. He saw his anger, his pain, and understood that Oliver blamed Clara more than him. She's your mother, Oliver, he said, trying to sound calm. She didn't mean to hurt you. This is between us. No, Oliver said, his voice wavering. This is about me too. I won't live with her after this. Can I stay with you? Tom fell silent, looking at him. He wanted to say yes, to take Oliver with him, to protect him from this chaos. But he knew it wasn't that simple. The hotel, the job, their lives that were now torn in half. Live here with me for now, he finally said. A night or two. I'll find an apartment soon, and we'll figure it out. But you have to talk to Mom. She's still your family. I don't want to, Oliver said, lowering his head. She disappointed me, Dad. Tom nodded, feeling his own disappointment mingling with his son's pain. I understand, he said quietly. Stay here. Rest. We'll figure it out. Oliver lay down on the bed without undressing and closed his eyes. Thomas Reynolds woke up Saturday morning in his Harbor Inn room to the sound of a passing truck rumbling down the street outside his window. He lay on the narrow bed, feeling the springs dig into his back, and looked at the ceiling, where a stain from an old leak reminded him of a map of some unknown island. His bag sat against the wall, still unpacked after 3 nights here, and next to it lay a signed copy of the separation agreement. He rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the stubble, and realized that he could no longer remain in this temporary shelter. He needed a new life, or at least a semblance of one. Tom stood up, took a shower in the tiny bathroom with yellowed tiles, and put on a clean shirt from his bag. He opened his laptop and started looking for apartments in downtown Seattle, something small, inexpensive, but with windows and no damp smell. An hour later, he found an option, a studio apartment in the Belltown area, in an old brick building overlooking Elliott Bay. The rental was within his budget, and the owner promised to show it this afternoon. Tom called, made an appointment, and checked out of the hotel, leaving the key on the counter with the same gray-haired woman who didn't even look up from her magazine. Belltown was bustling and lively, even on a Saturday morning under gray skies. The streets smelled of coffee from numerous cafes and the salty wind from the bay. Tom parked his pickup in front of the building, a 5-story building with peeling paint and a fire escape on the front. The owner, a balding man of about 50 in a checkered shirt, was waiting for him at the entrance with the keys in his hands. "Tom Reynolds," he asked, holding out his hand. "I'm Jack. Come on, I'll show you the 4th floor." Tom nodded, shook his hand, and followed him into the narrow entrance, which smelled of old wood and someone's dinner from yesterday. They took the elevator, which creaked like an old man, and emerged into a corridor with faded carpet. Apartment 4B was small but bright, with a large window overlooking the bay where ferries sailed lazily towards the horizon. The room was empty, with bare walls and wooden floors. The kitchen was tiny with a stove and sink, and the bathroom was clean with new fixtures. "It's not a palace, but you can live," Jack said, crossing his arms. "Wanting $200 a month, plus utilities. The furniture is yours, but there is a closet and a bed if needed." "Fits," Tom said, looking out the window. The view of the water reminded him of walks by the bay, but now it was his, not his and Clara's. "When can I move in?" "At least today," Jack replied. "We'll sign the contract, give you a deposit, and the keys are yours." Tom nodded, feeling strangely relieved. It was a beginning not ideal, but real. He signed the papers, handed over a check for $2,400 first month and security deposit, and received the keys. By noon, he returned to the hotel, picked up his bag, and moved his belongings to his new apartment. There were few of them clothes, a laptop, several books on engineering, which he took from home a week ago. He bought sheets and coffee at the corner store, and by evening he was sitting on the bare bed, looking out at the bay through the window. This was his new life, and it seemed empty and free at the same time. On Monday, he returned to the Pacific Bridgeworks office, trying to look his normal self. His desk by the window was littered with drawings of the Snoqualmie Bridge, and he threw himself into his work, checking calculations and making notes. But his thoughts still returned to Clara, her tears, her signature, her words about freedom. He hadn't called her since Thursday, and she hadn't texted her since that night's text. This silence was louder than any words. "Tom, you're kind of quiet today," Sarah Miller's voice came from behind him. He turned around, seeing her with a mug of coffee in her hands. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a short ponytail, and her green eyes looked at him with slight concern. She was wearing a dark blue sweater and jeans, simple but stylish as always. "I'm just working," he said, forcing himself to smile. "Lots of things to do." "I don't believe it," she said, sitting down on the edge of his table. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "Something at home." Tom sighed, leaning back in his chair. He didn't want to drag Sarah into this again, but her directness and the way she had listened to him before made her the only person he could talk to. "The house is gone," he said quietly. "I rented an apartment in Belltown. Clara and I signed a separation agreement. This is the end." Sarah fell silent, her gaze becoming more serious. "Damn it, Tom. I thought you would talk again. Did she really go through with it?" "Yes," He nodded, looking out the window. She kissed that guy, Dan. She said she could go further. I couldn't live with it. I went to the hotel, and now here I am. Idiot, Sarah said, her tone harsh. Sorry, but that's how it is. You're a good man, Tom. She doesn't know what she's missing. He chuckled, but the laugh was bitter. Maybe he knows. She just doesn't care. She wants freedom. Let him receive it. Sarah nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. And you? What now? I don't know, he admitted. I live day by day. Work, apartment, beer in the evenings. New life, perhaps. Sounds like a start, she said, smiling. Listen, let's go somewhere after work. Let's have a drink and talk. You need to shake yourself up. Tom looked at her, feeling warm at her offer. He didn't want to sit alone in an empty apartment, listening to the sound of the bay and thinking about Clara. Okay, he said. Where? The Belltown pub, she answered. 6 blocks from your new lair. Meet me there at 6? Agreed, he nodded. In the evening, he came to the pub, a cozy place with wooden walls, dim light, and a long counter behind which the bartender poured beer. Sarah was already there, sitting at a table by the window overlooking the street. She ordered 2 IPAs and raised her mug as he sat down across from her. To a new life, she said, clinking glasses with him. For her, he replied, taking a sip. The beer was cold and bitter, and he liked it. They talked about work, about the bridge, about how the interns in the office were confusing the drawings. Then Sarah talked about her dog, a Labrador named Max, who recently ate her shoe. Tom laughed, feeling the tension release for the first time in a week. Towards the end of the evening, their conversation became easier, and when they went outside, he realized that he wanted to see her again. Thank you, he said, standing under the lantern. I needed it. You're welcome, she replied, her smile warm. Let's do it again, maybe on Friday. Yes, he said, feeling something stir within him. On Friday. The following days, he began to communicate more often with Sarah. They drank coffee in the office, exchanged jokes, and on Friday, they went to the pub again. By the next week, their meetings had become dates informal, but with a slight flirtation that he did not expect from himself. They ate dinner at a small pizzeria in Belltown, walked along the waterfront, and Tom noticed how her presence filled the void left by Clara. It wasn't love, not yet, but the friendship was growing into something more, and he was letting it happen. Meanwhile, Clara spent the weekend with Dan. On Saturday, she went to his studio, taking a bottle of wine and her photographs. The rain was falling outside the windows again, but it was warm inside. Dan turned on the heater, and Nick Cave's music filled the space. They sat on the couch, looking at pictures of her, and his hand was on her shoulder. You have talent, he said, looking at the photograph of the wet street. It's like a melody, only without sound. Thank you, she replied, smiling. Her heart beat faster, but now there was less guilt. She signed the papers, Tom left, and she felt free, although lonely. They drank wine, and the conversation fell into silence. Dan leaned in and kissed her, slowly, firmly, and she responded, her arms wrapping around his neck. It was different from the first time. Now she did not retreat, did not fight with herself. They spent the night together, crossing the line she told Tom about for the first time. She went home in the morning, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. Dan was with her, but Tom, his shadow, was still hovering somewhere nearby. It was a gray and chilly morning in Seattle, with winds blowing low clouds over Puget Sound and stripping the last leaves from the trees. Thomas Reynolds stood in front of the county courthouse downtown, looking up at its austere gray stone facade. His pickup truck was parked across the street, and in his hands he held a folder with documents that today were supposed to put an end to his marriage with Clara. It had been just over 2 weeks since he signed the separation agreement, and the court was now officially finalizing their divorce. He straightened the collar of his jacket, feeling the cold creeping under the fabric, and went inside. The courtroom was small, with wooden benches and dim light from chandeliers in the ceiling. Tom sat in the front row, next to the lawyer he had hired through Harris and Associates, a short man named Paul with tired eyes and a stack of papers in his hands. Clara sat across the aisle, wearing a dark green coat and her hair pulled back into a ponytail. She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the judge's table, where a female judge in a black robe was leafing through their file. There was silence between them, not hostile, but heavy like the air before a storm. Case number 25-1047, Reynolds v. Reynolds, the judge announced, her voice dry and matter-of-fact. Divorce without contestation. Both sides are present. Are there any objections to the proposed division of property? Paul stood up, straightening his tie. No, Your Honor. My client, Thomas Reynolds, agrees to the terms set forth in the separation agreement. He leaves the family home to Clara Reynolds, taking only the boat registered in his name and half of their joint savings of $43,000. No alimony is required since both spouses are financially independent. The minor son, Oliver Reynolds, will live with his mother, with visitation rights for the father by arrangement. The judge nodded, turning the page. Mrs. Reynolds, do you agree to these terms? Clara stood up, her movement slow, almost mechanical. Yes, Your Honor, she said quietly. Her voice was even, but there was a hint of fatigue in it. I agree. Okay, the judge said, looking at them over her glasses. Based on the lack of objection and compliance with a 6-month separation period required by Washington state law, I grant the divorce. The decision takes effect immediately. The documents will be prepared by the end of the day. Case closed. She slammed the hammer, and the sound echoed throughout the hall. Tom felt something inside him tighten, and then let go, not relief, but a strange emptiness. He stood up, nodded to Paul, who was already collecting his papers, and walked towards the exit. Clara remained sitting, looking at the floor, her hands clutching the strap of her bag. He didn't look back. Outside, the wind hit him in the face, bringing with it the smell of wet asphalt and the sea. Tom walked over to the pickup truck, threw the folder on the passenger seat, and got behind the wheel. He didn't go right away, he just sat there, looking at the people hurrying under their umbrellas, and tried to understand what he was feeling. 24 years of marriage ended in 10 minutes in this room. The house was left to Clara, the boat to him, the money was divided in half. Oliver chose to live with her, although he spent more time with him at the hotel in recent days. It was the end, and he didn't know whether to rejoice or mourn. He started the engine and drove to Belltown, to his new apartment. She was already settling in the bed was made, there was a coffee pot in the kitchen, and a couple of books lay on the windowsill. The boat Paul was talking about remained in the garage at home, an old wooden vessel that he had once dreamed of restoring. He decided to pick her up next week, when Clara was at work, so as not to interfere with each other. This was all that he took from their common life, except for half of the savings, which he had already transferred to his account. That evening he opened a beer and sat by the window looking out over Elliott Bay. The lights of the ferries flickered in the darkness, and he thought about Sarah, their dates, their conversations, her smile. She was with him yesterday as he prepared for trial and said, "You can do it, Tom. It's just a step." He called her, feeling that he didn't want to be alone. "Hello," she said. Her voice warmed despite the noise in the background. She seemed to be in a cafe. "How did it go?" "It's over," he said, taking a sip of his beer. "The court approved. I'm free, or whatever it's called." "Free," she repeated, and there was something soft in her tone. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I feel empty. But yeah, okay. Do you want to come in? I have a beer and a view of the bay." "Tempting," she laughed. "Give me half an hour. I'm in Belltown, not far away." 40 minutes later, she knocked on the door, holding a paper bag with 2 bottles of IPA and a box of pizza. Her blonde hair was slightly damp from the drizzle, and her green eyes sparkled in the lamplight. "Freedom holiday," she said, putting the package on the table. "I couldn't come empty-handed." Tom smiled sincerely for the first time that day. "Thank you, Sarah. You didn't have to." "I know," she answered, taking off her jacket. "But I wanted to. Let's eat while it's hot." They sat by the window, eating pizza and drinking beer, looking out over the bay. The conversation was light about work, about her dog Max, about how she once got stuck in the office elevator. Tom felt her presence fill the void, and it was the best thing that happened to him that day. Meanwhile, Clara returned home from court, throwing her bag on the sofa. The house was quiet. Oliver still hadn't returned from Tom's, and she didn't know when he would show up. She walked into the kitchen, took a bottle of wine from the refrigerator, and poured herself a full glass. Her fingers trembled as she brought it to her lips, and she drank half of it in one gulp. The divorce was completed. The judge slammed her gavel, and everything she built with Tom became a thing of the past. The house was hers, but it seemed alien without his steps, without his voice. She called Dan, feeling that she couldn't be alone. "Hi," he said, his voice soft and slightly hoarse. "How are you?" "The divorce is over," she said, her tone even but brittle. "Everything is official. Do you want to come in? I have wine and, I don't know, just come in." "I'll be there in an hour," he replied. "Hold on, Clara." He arrived with a bottle of red and a bag of food from a Thai restaurant on Capitol Hill. They sat in the living room, eating pad Thai and drinking wine, while outside the window the wind blew clouds over the bay. Clara turned on the music. Bill Evans, "Waltz for Debbie," and the melody filled the silence. Dan looked at her, his dark eyes attentive but calm. "Are we celebrating?" he asked, raising his glass. "Probably," she said, clinking glasses with him. "Freedom, right? I'm officially single now." "Not alone," he said, leaning closer. "I'm here." She smiled, feeling warm from the wine and his words. They kissed, slowly, deeply, and she let herself drown in it. Later they went up to the bedroom, and she gave herself to him, celebrating her freedom the way she had wanted from the beginning. His hands, his voice, his smell, everything was new, alive, and she clung to it like a life preserver. But when he fell asleep next to him, Clara lay with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling. Her body was satisfied, but an emptiness grew inside, cold, quiet, like the bay outside the window. She thought about Tom, where he is, who he is with, how he feels. The house was her, but without him he was just walls. Dan was with her, but he didn't fill that hole. She celebrated, but tears flowed down her cheeks, and she couldn't stop them. Freedom turned out to be harder than she thought. The year passed in Seattle like a fog over the Puget Sound, quickly, quietly, and leaving behind only the vague outlines of the past. October arrived with cold winds and golden leaves carpeting the streets. Thomas Reynolds now lived in his apartment in Belltown, which over the course of the year had acquired the details of a new life. An IKEA sofa, a shelf with books on engineering, several photographs of Oliver and old friends on the wall. The boat he'd taken back after his divorce sat in the garage at his co-worker's house, still unfinished, but he'd go there on weekends to tinker with it. The Snoqualmie Bridge was completed, and he was now designing a new interchange in Tacoma, his days filled with drawings, coffee, and quiet evenings with Sarah Miller. Oliver went to college. He entered the University of Washington, choosing the engineering faculty, like his father. After the divorce, he lived with Clara, but their relationship remained strained. He blamed her for the breakup of the family and spent more time with Tom when he returned home for the holidays. Now, in his first semester, he called Tom more often than his mother, talking about lectures, the dorm, and a girl named Emma, whom he met in class. Tom listened to him with a smile, feeling that at least he had not lost touch with his son. Clara stayed in the house overlooking the bay, but it no longer felt like home to her. She continued to teach music at the Ballard School, but her lessons lost their former spark. The children noticed that Mrs. Reynolds was more often silent, looking out the window. Dan Harris became a part of her life. They met almost every weekend, spent the night in his studio or her bedroom, drank wine, and listened to jazz. But a year later, she began to understand that he did not want anything serious. He was a free spirit, a photographer who lived in the moment, no plans, no promises. The freedom she fought for turned out to be an illusion, and the emptiness she felt after her divorce only grew. One evening, sitting in the living room with a glass of wine, Clara looked at the photo on the fireplace. Her Tom and Oliver on the beach in Ocean Shores, taken 5 years ago. Her fingers squeezed the stem of the glass, and she suddenly realized that she missed Tom, not their routine, but his reliability, his quiet presence. Dan slept upstairs, but his warmth didn't touch her the way Tom's once did. She took out her phone and dialed his number, not thinking what she would say. "Hello," Tom answered after the third ring. His voice was even, but with a slight weariness. "Tom, it's me," she said, her voice trembling. "How are you?" "Okay," he said, and she heard the sound of water. It seemed like he was washing the dishes. "And you?" "Also." "Okay," she lied, feeling the tears welling up. "Did Oliver call you? He rarely writes to me." "Yes, yesterday," he answered. "He's doing well. Studying, meeting someone." "How are you, Clara?" She hesitated, looking at the photograph. I, I'd like to meet Tom. Talk." Just like that, without anything. Tom fell silent, and she heard him turn off the water. "I don't think this is a good idea," he said finally. "I have a different life now. Sarah is with me. I don't want to bring up the past." "Sarah," Clara repeated, feeling a pang in her chest. "Are you serious?" "Yes," he said simply. "We are together. Sorry, Clara, but I can't meet you. It won't change anything." She nodded, although he couldn't see her, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "I understand," she said quietly. "Good luck, Tom." "You too," he replied, and the line went dead. Clara dropped the phone on the sofa and covered her face with her hands. Dan didn't want her forever. Tom went to Sarah. Oliver moved away. Her new reality was lonely, and she didn't know how to fix it. A week later, fate brought them together again at the wedding of mutual friends, John and Lisa, in Tacoma. John was an engineer with whom Tom worked early in his career, and Lisa taught at the same school as Clara. The invitation came to both, and they knew that they would meet, but they could not refuse. There was too much connecting them with this couple. The wedding took place at a small country club overlooking Commencement Bay, where the sunset colored the water gold and pink. Tom arrived with Sarah. She wore a dark blue dress, her blonde hair falling over her shoulders, and her green eyes sparkling as she laughed at his joke in the car. They entered the hall holding hands, and Tom felt almost happy Sarah became his support, his new reality. Clara came alone. Dan said he didn't like weddings, and she didn't insist. She wore a simple black dress, her hair was down, but there was something tired, almost lost, about her face. She sat at a table by the window, looking out at the guests as the orchestra played a slow tune. Their gazes met across the hall, and Tom felt something inside him tighten. He had not seen her since the trial, and now she seemed like a stranger to him, not the Clara he loved, but a woman who chose a different path. Sarah noticed his gaze and squeezed his hand. "Is this her?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he nodded. "Don't worry. Everything is in the past." "I'm not worried," she said, smiling. "But if you want to talk to her, go. I don't mind." Tom shook his head, but when the band started playing "The Way You Look Tonight," he saw Clara stand up and head towards the dance floor alone, with a glass of wine in her hand. He couldn't help himself. He turned to Sarah. "One dance," he said, "just for the sake of old times." "Go," she said, her smile soft. "I'll wait." Tom approached Clara, feeling his heart beating faster. She turned around when she saw him, and her eyes widened. "Tom," she said, her voice hoarse, "I didn't expect it." "Me too," he replied, holding out his hand. "Shall we dance?" She nodded, placing the glass on the table, and took his hand. They took to the dance floor, their movements cautious, almost awkward. The orchestra played, and Tom felt her warmth familiar, but distant. They were silent at first, just moving in rhythm, but then Clara spoke. "Do you remember our wedding?" she said quietly. "You stepped on my dress, and I almost fell." Tom smiled, remembering. "Yes, and you spilled wine on my tie. We laughed until we cried." "It was fun," she said, her voice shaking. "I miss those times, Tom." "Me too," he admitted, looking into her eyes. "But it passed, Clara. We can't go back." She nodded, her fingers squeezing his shoulder. "I know. Dan, he doesn't want anything serious. And you and Sarah, are you happy?" "Yes," he said simply. She's different, but good." "I'm glad," Clara said, and tears sparkled in her eyes. Forgive me, Tom, for everything. I've already forgiven you, he answered, feeling her words sink into his chest. And forgive yourself. Move on with your life. The music ended, and they stopped, looking at each other. Clara smiled weakly but sincerely and let go of his hand. Thank you for the dance, she said. Goodbye, Clara, he answered, and it was not a farewell with an insult, but simply the end. She returned to her table, took a glass, and went to the window, looking at the bay. Tom returned to Sarah, who was waiting for him with a smile. Everything is fine? She asked, taking his hand. Yes, he said, squeezing her fingers. Now for sure. They danced some more, laughed with friends, and drank toasts to John and Lisa. Clara stayed until the end, but left early, alone, into the cold Tacoma night. Tom and Sarah returned to Seattle late, and he looked at her in the car, feeling that his new reality was here with her. Clara returned home to an empty house, where Oliver was now only a guest and Dan a temporary companion. She turned on Bill Evans, sat by the window, and looked at the bay, thinking that sometimes our desires can be very wrong. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.